Thank you for the invitation to deliver a plenary lecture at the 2021 BSA Annual Conference, Remaking the Future. Through my research, I have long argued that to remake the future, we need to better understand our past. And we need to understand how that past is embedded in repertoires of sociological concepts and in definitions of relevant problems, in ways that make it difficult to think of a future different to that past. Sociology's orientation to history has generally been based around an implicit consensus on the emergence of modernity and the related rise of the West. It has also privileged a particular understanding of Europe associated with the stadial idea of progressive development. In my first book, Rethinking Modernity, Postcolonialism and the Sociological Imagination, I took issue with such understandings. I argued both that the endogenous processes deemed significant in understanding the key events of modernity had broader conditions of emergence and development, and that there was a need to acknowledge other global processes, such as colonialism and the European trade in human beings, that were usually not addressed by sociology. European colonialism was the context within which modernity developed, and within which the social theory identified as the modern canon was formulated. Yet colonialism received little explicit consideration within that canon. This talk draws on arguments made in a book co-authored with John Homewood, Colonialism and Modern Social Theory, which is forthcoming from Polity. In it, we argue that colonialism is displaced from accounts of modern social theory and at best is represented as a phenomenon associated with the transition from feudalism to capitalist modernity. And it is around this transition that sociology organized its key concepts and analytical categories, but without taking colonialism into account. This displacement of colonialism constitutes a double displacement, where the rise of European imperialism out of colonialism is also neglected, or as in the case of Marx, represented as following from capitalism's global expansion. The consolidation of modern social theory in the writings of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim coincided with the height of European empires and global war between them. Yet empire lay outside the dominant frame of mainstream social theory, except as a phenomenon associated with earlier historical periods and civilizations, as in the work of Eisenstadt. Even in the work of Du Bois, a theorist excluded from the canon until recently, the issue of colonialism was not immediately evident, but rather something worked towards from an initial address of the seeming particularities of race relations in the US. The end of the Second World War gave rise to the growth of secondary and higher education across Europe, the US, and elsewhere. It was a period in which sociology expanded and was fully incorporated into university curricula in many countries. In Europe, this coincided with the dismantling of empires and the beginning of a new politics after empire. It was a politics explicitly focused on the nation and its new social settlements, themselves associated with the growth of education. Sociology became centered on divisions framed as internal to post-war developments of nation states. For example, the class stratification of outcomes and opportunities, or the gendered nature of public life and inequalities of power in the private sphere. A canon of social theory which neglected colonialism and empire was oven ready for a post-war sociology in the context of the dismantling of empire and looking forward to the modernization of domestic social structures. This is despite the fact that, as I've recently argued in the BJS lecture, colonial subjects continued to pay for the modernizing British welfare state despite not being included within it. Indeed, part of the explanation for the fiscal crisis the welfare state enters in the 1970s derives from the running down of this coerced colonial payment. During the post-war period, most European countries were confronted by anti-colonial movements and challenges to their global dominance. For example, there was a war of independence by Algeria from the French Empire, which occurred simultaneously with Algeria being a subordinate part of the European Economic Community. India had earlier declared independence from Britain, and this was followed by movements of decolonization across the British Empire. In the subsequent decades, such movements systematically transformed the world order. However, these challenges to the political structures of European modernity did not seem to impinge on what sociology saw as its jurisdiction. Rather, they were seen as the political entanglements of individual nation states, but not as defining their social structures or societies. These events were not understood as the culmination and consequence of a systematic process integral to a modernity that was otherwise represented independently of them. This is because colonialism and empire had not been part of the concerns of sociologists and social theorists, even during the period of its height. The issue now, I suggest, is not simply to add colonialism to sociology's repertoire of topics, but to show how that repertoire has been structured by the absence of its consideration and must be fundamentally transformed. As such, the argument I'm making here is for a renewal of social theory and sociology, not an addition to it or their rejection. Central to this renewal is to recognize and address 5 fictions that currently organize their conceptual frameworks. The fiction of stages of social development, the fiction of modern subjectivity, the fiction of the nation state, the fiction of class and formerly free labour, and finally the fiction of sociological reason. These fictions are presented as a distillation of the lessons to be learnt from an examination of the classical tradition. In colonialism and modern social theory, we do not take issue with the centrality of the selected authors to contemporary sociology, but we do take issue with what contemporary sociology takes to be central. The first of the fictions is associated with the idea of a state of nature. This was developed in Hobbes and Locke as part of their discussions of the possession and use of resources available in common. It appears to establish a common humanity, but it does so in order to justify inequality and differential treatment. It is a construction which depends upon a distinction between the state of nature and the state of society, where the latter is the colonizing society of Europe. Out of this initial construction, there arises a concern to delineate the characteristics of modern society against which other societies can be described and classified. Once stages of society are delineated, it becomes possible to arrange them hierarchically in terms of ideas of development and progress, and to associate particular kinds of social relationship with each type of society. It's evident that colonialism is directly connected to the emergence of modern society, but it comes to be attributed to a late stage of feudal society, involving encounters with people at earlier stages of development. The taking of other people into possession is then understood not simply as beneficial for those who derive profit from it, but also as a civilizing process for those who are subject to it. We need to move away from the idea of types of society which can be understood separately from the relationships among them, and instead understand how it is those very connections that structure ideas of difference and domination. The idea of progress and the normative weight attached to it is connected to the second fiction, that of the special nature of modern subjectivity. Modern society is understood to inaugurate a distinctive kind of subjectivity associated with the modern individual and his or her self-determining capacity to act on the basis of reason and self-interest. This is the individual capable of property, contrasted to those who are either incapable of or indifferent to property. Yet these latter states are the product of European colonialism and not simply the condition it confronted. In the tradition of modern social theory, modern reason is about the development of autonomy and freedom, and about subjecting institutions, including those of religion, to criticism on the basis of reason. This construction is powerful because it also inaugurates the possibility of self-criticism, as is outlined, for example, in the approach of Frankfurt School critical theory. The very idea of an unfinished project of modernity entails the idea of modernity itself as a project of civilization, where all pre-modern societies are understood as beset by traditional authority and inadequate selves, and not as the basis of knowledge and experiences from which we can also learn. The third fiction is the idea of the nation state. In the development of the idea of the modern individual, two forms of sovereignty are outlined. One is the individual as sovereign, and the other is that of the political authority that guarantees the liberty of sovereign individuals. In early modern thought, that political authority is associated with a commonwealth, with no necessary territorial limits, and indeed in justifying the extension of territory. However, the exercise of political authority comes to be associated over time with nation states and European nation states in particular. Weber's formulation has become the exemplary expression of the position within sociology. The nation state is understood to have a legitimate claim to the monopoly of violence within a given territory, with legitimacy associated with the state's responsibility for and to its citizens within that territory. Yet, not all members of the population are regarded as citizens or members of what Tocqueville called the society of equals. Further, all European nation states, including their settler offshoots, were either empires or participated in the construction of empires through the movement of their populations. The latter movement both consolidated empires and contributed to their societies being, in fact, societies of unequals. Subjects of empire are denied inclusion in the community to whom the patrimony of empire is distributed, and after decolonization, come to be denied citizenship within former colonizing societies. This is the context in which those who share a common political heritage of empire are now represented as immigrants within its metropoles, and as such, presented as threats to the solidarity of the nation and its social contract. The fourth fiction is that of class and formerly free labor. Marx recognized that modern society was developing as a society of unequals, that is, as a class-divided society. This class division he associated with the system of private property. On the basis of the development of the class relation, proletarian agency would develop to transform private property and create the new society. The class division that Marx described depends upon the centrality of formerly free labor and the commodification of labor power within capitalist modernity. This role is called into question, however, once we understand the colonial and imperial nature of modernity. Commodified labor power does not develop as the central form of capitalism, and moreover, capitalist nation states are able to divide their populations between national citizens and colonial subjects. As Du Bois noted, this provides possibilities of the decommodification of labor power within the metropole, utilizing colonial patrimonies in the provision of welfare and other collective goods nationally that are then denied to those in the wider empire. At the same time, colonial subjects are denied the status of free labor and are subordinated within various forms of indenture. In this context, enslavement represents the commodification of the laborer, while the abolition of slavery does not give rise to free labor, but to new forms of indenture. Both are enduring features of modernity. For example, indenture returns within the metropole in the form of the treatment of migrant labor as not deserving the rights and rewards associated with the citizenship status afforded to nationals, something that we see in the seasonal visa arrangements for migrant workers in post-Brexit Britain, something which is not a contingency of Brexit, but deeply embedded in the social and political structures of modernity. Karen E. Fields, a recent translator of Durkheim, states that, and I quote, "Unreasonable divisions of humankind seem to be born from reason itself, not from its opposite." This leads to the final fiction of sociological reason. It is perhaps easy to understand that Enlightenment thought has its darker side, and even to consider sociology as being both within and outside that tradition. However, sociology's task cannot only be to reveal that darker side, but also to consider its own implication in its construction. The dominant forms of sociological method all present sociological reason as ahistorical and as the necessary presupposition for objective inquiry. In this way, sociological reason is made part of the general claim of the Enlightenment, and sociology's difference is simply the extent to which it aligns itself with a critical project that continues it. However, this project is not the self-critical project it claims to be. Understanding sociology as historically formed would place it into conversation with those represented as other and open it to learning. This is not a form of relativism or an argument for multiple perspectives, but for the transformation of our own perspective as a consequence of learning from others. The first step in any process of learning is the recognition of a limitation in one's own understanding. Remaking the future requires us to better understand how we arrived in the present. It requires us to better understand the limitations of how that past has been understood by our discipline. Colonialism structures European modernity as well as European thought, and in consequence, recognizing its significance is an opportunity as well as a necessity to practice sociology differently. Thank you for listening.